G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. Now, a little while ago, I uploaded a walk around of Lilibet, our 1956 Land Rover Series 109. And to be honest, I wasn't exactly expecting the response that it received. Now, amongst all of the very, very positive comments, there kept coming up one particular question, and it was, well, did you actually film the restoration? Now, it turns out, yes, that I actually did. The funny thing is, though, is that none of the footage was actually ever filmed for YouTube. I remember 2 years ago, this channel didn't even exist, and it certainly wasn't the purpose of filming for YouTube and to actually share. What I did was simply put the camera on in the corner, put it on time lapse with a view to actually look back to how to actually put things back together. Didn't actually imagine that anyone would actually end up watching it. Now, before we jump in, I think it's worth explaining what the project was, or more importantly, actually what it wasn't. I'd never repaired rust, I hadn't cut original panels apart, certainly hadn't welded repairs into 70-year-old steel. And for me, I hadn't used products like Evapor Rust, I never sprayed epoxy primer, I hadn't picked up a spray gun, to be fair, and painted a vehicle. So everything that you're about to watch, or almost everything, was completely new to me. And I think that's important because this isn't a tutorial from someone who's been restoring Land Rovers for 30 years. It's a story of someone, much like the entire channel is built around, of learning as we go along. This was never meant to be a concourse restoration, and I've said it time and time again. It's not about building a museum piece or a garage queen or a pavement princess. It wasn't about trying to make it better than when it left the factory. I had a very, very simple goal, and that was to actually preserve as much of the original vehicle as I could reasonably, repair what genuinely needed repairing, replace only what couldn't be saved, but importantly, making it structurally sound, making it safe, making it reliable. But again, the most important thing for me was to make sure that this old Series 1 could keep doing exactly what it was built to do, be driven. Now, because this episode is really about the bulkhead and the cab, it's probably worth explaining why I spent so much time on what most people would probably describe as just an old rusty firewall. Now, the bulkhead, of course, is one of the most important structural parts of the Series 1. So it, along with the chassis, are the only two steel components within the car. The rest of the panels, of course, being aluminium and Burma-Bright. Now, within the bulkhead on the Series 1, of course, steering column, pedals, dashboard, windscreen, and as I said, apart from the other panels, which are aluminium, the bulkhead is steel. So to be fair, after nearly 70 years, rust wasn't a surprise. It was expected, and we could see a lot of it. But the real question wasn't about whether there'd be rust. The question was, could we actually save the original bulkhead or not? Now, everything you're about to watch happened over the course of a week for the main components, and then a number of weekends after that. Time-lapse has a funny way of making hours disappear in a matter of seconds. So what looks like a few minutes on screen often represent an entire afternoon into an evening, and then again back into the morning again. To be honest, looking back now, I am really glad that I pressed record. Anyway, that's enough talking. Let's wind the clock back 2 years. Now, in a previous video, I do go into great detail around the actual purchasing of Lilibet from an auction site. Everything from the research to the for sale ads to trawling auction sites, both here and overseas. So if you want a little bit more detail, then of course jump back and watch that video. But for those who are new to the channel, I purchased Lilibet off an auction site. Now, of course, sight unseen physically, but of course I'd been through the ad, which was quite comprehensive from video and photo in regards to condition, etc. Now, she was drivable, certainly not for the distance. I purchased her from around 12-hour drive away from where we're located within New South Wales. So driving her wasn't an option, least of all the fact that I had just recently broken my leg. Coincidentally, Mrs. Supo Day had on the same day, separate incidents, but you know, that's for another YouTube video and another day. So I needed to get her up to me, so we had her trucked up. Now, incidentally, the cost of getting Lilibet to me door to door was $900. Now, that's across a 1,200 kilometre distance from a pretty remote location down in the Mornington Peninsula. Now, regardless of the fact that I'd broken my leg, you know, Lilibet was not registered, and I certainly wouldn't have attempted to drive any vehicle that length of distance you know, sight unseen, and I certainly hadn't been given the opportunity to do a mechanical look over either. So it's worth looking at various carriers. You know, there's options depending upon how quickly you need the vehicle, whether you're in a rush or not, whether you want open top or you know, enclosed carry. So for me, obviously time was not a concern. I definitely didn't need her to be an enclosed transport. So I looked and waited for basically a carrier that needed to fill a load, and so that's why the price was obviously quite fair. So well worth looking depending upon obviously your circumstances and to which of those factors that you obviously need to bring into consideration as well. Now this is taken probably about 2 weeks after I'd had Lilibet, so a little bit of a cleanup had already taken place, but it was really just to record the rust itself. And again, it was not a surprise. It was where it was expected, as from the video and the pictures from the for sale ad. So really concentrated in that top rail of the bulkhead. That then it deteriorated into pooling then on top of the bulkhead, and of course causing a hole where the steering column attaches to the underside of that bulkhead. So the ventilation levers were also cactus, you know, from there. And upon closer inspection, that entire top rail had actually rusted completely through. So it was held together basically by the rubber seal that goes along the top of that rail, some silicone that the guy's previous owners had actually put in place. So it was not, you know, going to be a repair job. It actually had to then be cut out and actually replaced. So we'll get into that obviously later into the video. Now a little bit of surface rust or some light pitting into the footwells, which is pretty common obviously for these Land Rover Series as well. The Lucas wiper motors, both of them were cactus, even though they were wired up. They'd been fried, obviously sparked from some water, but then the gearing inside was completely finished, so I pulled those apart and redid those, but we'll see that later on. The passenger side, not as obviously as bad as the driver's side, with some light pitting, so a little bit of evapor rust, just as a bit of a temporary measure to just see the impact, but really it was time to actually get the project underway. Now, a few weeks after Lilibet arrived, I was actually back mobile physically, so able to really get in and give her a refresh mechanically. So that was understanding the system as well. I hadn't worked on a car of this vintage or from that era before, so cleaning out the oil air bath filter system, understanding how that is different from the traditional, or what I was used to at least, an air pod filter system or air panel filter. Cleaning out the sediment bowls within the fuel system, changing over some of the fuel lines which needed a look at, cleaning out the carby, the jets, making sure all of that was running fine, and then of course into the Dizzy from a spark standpoint from there. Now, one of the single greatest improvements that we made at that point, and still to be honest to this day, was actually to install electronic ignition. So that was a piece that sits within the original distributor, so it looks as stock as possible, and unless you're keen-eyed and can spot the additional wire running to the coil, it looks as stock as she rolled out of the factory for. But what it meant was, you know, it starts first time every time, and again is still the greatest single improvement mechanically that we have made to the vehicle to this point. Everything was going well at this point, except from spark, and you know, we basically troubleshot back down to the fact that the new coil was actually causing us some issues. So, you know, believe it or not, we actually put the old Lucas original coil back in, and to this day it's still you know, running fine, you know, some 2 years later. So mechanically sorted, now it was time for the Meccano action. So that was doors off, roof off, windscreen off, and a chance to actually dive into the bulkhead. Remembering that the intention was to keep as much of the original bulkhead firewall as possible and only replace what could not be repaired. And that largely was the top rail, as you've seen earlier. So what we were doing here is measuring up the replacement part that I was able to source, but starting by removing obviously any latches and then the ventilation levers, and cutting out the old top rail, or to be fair, as you saw with the amount of damage, we probably could have pushed it out. Now, along with the bulkhead, the tunnel, seat box, etc., basically the entire inside of the cab was going to be refreshed at the same time. So it's time to start disassembling some of those pieces, and whilst the intention again was to try and keep as much of the original componentry as possible, the reality of 70-year-old seat bolts, etc., meant that a lot of them unfortunately had to be cut out. The next day started as the previous had finished, with me arm wrestling with 70-year-old bolts and Dean cleaning up the mating surfaces for which the top rail was going to be welded to. At this point, it was time to try and free up under the steering column so that we could actually cut a hole in the top of that bulkhead piece, or where the steering column attaches to the underside of the bulkhead, where there was that massive rust hole, to actually cut that out cleanly. Next was the instrument cluster, and the removal of that. Of course, we wanted to tidy up some of the wiring behind as well. 70-year-old wiring, some of it was absolutely original, and of course I wanted to keep the original gauges, etc. So time to unplug everything, unwire, try to tidy up what we can, but most importantly with some small hands that made light work of it, but able to actually label each connection as we went. I've certainly been burnt before trying to guess or remember, even from photos, so the best way was just to actually label and take photos as we went along. Seat box out next, and then just some cleaning to finish off another jam-packed day. Well, the day didn't end just because the sun went down, so inside we were now attacking the gauges. So the original Jaeger gauges from the instrument cluster, remembering I wanted to keep them original, but this was just a refresh of the rubber seals, the inner, the outer bezel, and then the glass within them as well. Now, the original instrument cluster panel had been butchered beyond repair by some of the previous owners with additional switches and knobs, etc. So I made the decision to simply put a new one in. So the next day started with trying to prepare the surfaces again as best as possible, with the intention of being able to mount that top rail by the middle of that day. So it was a mixture of wire wheeling, wire brushing, sanding, etc. Just trying to clean up as best as possible, and then obviously cutting some additional reinforcement or support tabs to go along with that top rail as well. At the same time as having the cab refreshed, I had looked into actually installing some seat belts, and in the form of just a lap sash. Now, the car, 1956, not required from a registration standpoint to have any seat belts, and to be honest, lap sashes don't really do a great deal. It's really the over the shoulders, which of course are then attached to a roll bar, and I wasn't going to have that in. So at least to put a lap sash in, a little more sense of security, particularly when I've got the young fellas in the car with me as well. So the idea was, let's cut, while we've got the seat box out, let's cut some panels for which we would attach it to. We'd then drill them down into the chassis underneath as well, and they would then become the mounting points. So you'll see those mounted later on. So for now, back to more wire wheeling, wire brushing and sanding, all in preparation for the next stages. So this is a very exciting phase. We've got the master welder Dean in action, putting that first bit or that first bracket, that plate back in to the top of the bulkhead to start the actual true repairs part of the restoration. There it was, the final tidy up again of the side pieces, really into the A and B pillar in regards to the supports that we're going to be holding that top rail replacement piece into place. So clean those up, fit them again, tidied up some of the reinforcements, and then Dean got back into action, welding it into place. Now, we could have spent days, of course, wire wheeling and sanding and getting the bulkhead back to bare metal. The intention, of course, again, not to have a concourse restoration. So it was really about removing the surface rust. If, of course, when there was deeper areas of rust, it was concentrated in those areas. So we decided we're at a point now where we could just go ahead and put the primer. Now, obviously, we're using primer in cans for the bigger pieces. We'll get to that in a moment, but they were out in the backyard and we could use the gun. But from a hard to reach standpoint, and of course, remember we're doing this at home, we decided to use the cans for easy access. So they were great. And then obviously one coat and then some light scuffing with some sandpaper in between, and then a second coat with all the pieces that was on the bulkhead. Seat box lids removed, all the latches drilled out, they'll be riveted back on, but all sanded back, wire wheeled back to the bare Burma bright. The seat back attachments that go to the back of the bulkhead, all given the same treatment at night, and then you'll see later, so primed and then painted from there. Whilst waiting for the cab and the bulkhead to actually dry, with the primer, it was into the backyard to then continue again sanding, wire wheeling, and then priming those individual pieces. That's everything from the tunnel, the seat box, the seat box lids again, and just really giving everything the 2 coats again, sanding in between, and then a second coat. And it's really front of the house, back of the house, letting it dry in and out, and really just on a rotation from there. And that night we attacked the hardtop roof, so the cab roof. It wasn't in too bad condition, to be fair, so it was just about removing the seal that was cactus at the top, so removing that bar and getting that seal out, and then rubbing back. I just wanted consistency from a paint standpoint with the interior of the cab, so that was the only purpose of doing this. Otherwise it could have stayed as it was. But to remove the window, which was perspex, and then all the silicone and the rubbish that went around that as well. Then another final coating of primer with the rest of the interior cab pieces, the ventilation levers, seat back, attachments, etc. Next morning started with another light scuff of the primer now that it had 2 coats on, then a clean out, and then excitingly the first coat of with the pump pack of the actual final color, the blue obviously, which I'd had color matched as close as possible, but at least all of the interior of the cab and the bulkhead was actually going to be the one consistent color. Then it was out the back for a few last minute pieces, their final coating of primer, and then into the blue, and then time to actually get to the fun bit, which was to set up the spray gun. Now, I hadn't used a spray gun before, so this was all something new for me, but what a terrific experience in being able to do the seat box inside the cab, the hard top, the tunnel, and of course all the locker box lids, seat box lids, etc. from there. So a terrific experience and a really great finish in the end as well from a paint standpoint. So after 2 coats, it is time for reassembly, and I've used all brand new componentry, all stainless steel pieces here when putting the seat box back together, and then all stainless steel rivets as well, and utilizing a gun for this. Otherwise it would have taken days and arm strength that we didn't have at this point. Then time for the lap sashes to be installed, so up from the chassis through the seat box, and then you can see where the top attachment is, so completely reversible but also hidden behind the seats if necessary. One detail I really wanted to preserve was the original factory chassis plate. It's a small part of the vehicle, but it still carries the original identity after almost 70 years. On top of that was also the separate Australian compliance plate, given that she was a CKD. So from the pressed metal company, so that was also left in place after being uncovered actually through the sanding of the original paint. The tunnel back in next, and she started to resemble a car again. So it was just the final pieces, you know, the amount of fittings that needed to go back in, but again, all new stainless steel. And so Dean on top, me underneath, just trying to figure out and, you know, put your hands through the pieces and, you know, don't mind the diff for the chassis and gearbox and just trying to get it all together. But yeah, very, very rewarding looking at it at this point as well. back inside after a very successful day, and it was time for some of the additions that I wanted to make, which was 3 switches, one for battery cutoff, one for an interior light, and one for a 4-wheel drive light bar, and then to also include 2 USB powered sockets. So that's for phones, for sat nav, etc. down the line. Just something that, of course, in 56 you didn't have to worry about, and just something that I could keep still in the original kind of look and feel. So I grabbed some parts from Emberton Imperial, and so obviously primed and coated those, and then we were just wiring them up tonight so that we could then install them tomorrow with the rest of the electrical pieces from the center console bed. And most of the wiring, the electrical going semi according to plan, at least, you know, relative to the electrical Gremlins. But the oil pressure and water temp gauges, they proved to be quite an absolute bear, to be honest. So that took far longer than what we had hoped, and I was actually regretting at that point actually refreshing them and pulling them out. But in the end, we persevered, and we managed to get there. So next up was all around the bulkhead, the vent flaps, etc. So that was trying to get the linkages correct, the hinges to go on the flaps. But the biggest challenge out of all of this was at the beginning was the seals. So yes, they came in a pack, and again I got them from Emberton Imperial, but you had to cut them to size properly, fit them, and then it was just a matter of on, off, you know, with the actual flaps themselves. But again, perseverance and time, and we got there, although even to this day I'm still not entirely happy with how the rubber seals sit. We needed a break from the vent flaps, so this one was a team effort. So getting a brand new seal across what was the brand new part, so the top of the rail, definitely took all 4 of us, and a little bit of pulling and pushing and some unkind words, but we eventually got it on, and then it was back to the vent flaps again. Dean was flying home in the morning, so this was really the last bit of the puzzle, and a chance to look back at the incredible amount of work that we're able to get done in such a short period of time. So only fitting that we jumped in, sans windscreen and roof, and went for a little burn around the block. And of course the girls who had helped out as well weren't to be left out, so they wanted a quick trip as well. Now with the bulkhead complete, I could finally refit the windscreen hinges, install the hold down clamps, and for the first time in a long time, with the help of Mr. Suit by Day, bolt the windscreen back in to where she belonged. I was getting the seats recovered into something a little more durable, so a canvas material, and getting a tawny for the tub made up in the following week. But I wanted to reinstall these anyway, just to kind of get that sense of completion to this stage. And then of course fitting the 1, 2, 3, 400 different knobs that come with a Series 1. Now with the seats off getting recovered, I was trying to turn the attention to the wiper motors. So they're the Lucas FW2s. So I stripped them down, got rid of all of the old grease that was in there, and basically there's a 3-gear reduction gearbox that's in there. So just rebuilt that, packed it with fresh grease, and then reassembled, cleaned the outsides. So I've got a separate video that is on that. And then of course with the motors rebuilt, I had some parts that were 3D printed that I thought I'd try in terms of fixing them back to the windscreen. So some of the grommets, the gaskets, and then the windscreen wiper attachment parts are actually a plastic component. So we thought we'd try those, and then obviously reinstalling them onto the car itself. And you might have noticed in one of the earlier clips that we'd already cut out the front muffler. So it's normally a 2 muffler system on the Series 1. The front one was far too gone. So as opposed to replacing it or repairing it, just cut it off and extended with a bit of straight pipe. With the rear still intact, she still sounds like a proper Series 1. Traditionally in a long wheelbase, the spare wheel sits in the back of the tub in the tray, but I love the look and always have, particularly in a series vehicle, of the spare on the bonnet, so that's what was decided. Now, I mentioned earlier that the electronic ignition was the single greatest mechanical upgrade that I've made. Well, these door cards from Exmoor trim, and no, it's not an ad, but they have been easily the greatest cosmetic improvement, certainly from a use standpoint. Obviously great storage when there's lack of in a series, but just really ties in with the canvas change out for the seats, and of course the tawny cover as well. They really just finished off this part of the restoration nicely. It was a great way to actually end this first stage of restoration for my Series 1. Well, there you have it. Now, it's funny even for me looking back at the footage now, because what you've just watched, as I mentioned at the very beginning, happened over the course of a single week with a couple of weekends, but almost 2 years ago. Now, at that time, I honestly thought that I was just recording the process again, just so we could record and remember how much or how everything actually fitted back together. Didn't imagine it would eventually become one of the first stories that I'd actually share on a channel, create a channel here on YouTube. Now, the project has taught me a lot. Of course, it's taught me about rust repair, a little bit about welding, but more to come from that. It's about painting, it's about the body work, it's about restoration, but more importantly for me and the ethos of the channel, it's about having the confidence to tackle something that I hadn't done before. Plenty of moments when I wasn't sure if I was making the right decision, and if I did not have the help of Dean, my best mate, to come in and help and support, it wouldn't have happened. There would have been plenty of moments when I was willing to throw it all around, and there were repairs that took far longer than expected, there were mistakes that were made, there was money that was spent in areas that I didn't think we'd have to spend money, but definitely moments where I questioned whether I was actually up for it at all. However, it all made the finished result well worth it, of course, and very much all very rewarding from there. One thing that I hope that the video has shown is that you don't have to know everything it is about getting your hands dirty, and of course that's what the channel is as well. So come along, continue with this restoration journey. The next video is of course going to talk about the restoration of the tub, then the back of the tub, and a few other pieces, and then of course regular maintenance. So jump on board, like the video if you haven't, subscribe of course if you haven't done that already as well. But as I said, come along for the journey, and we'll see you in the next one.